Many jurisdictions have specific minimum depth requirements for out-of-footing concrete encased electrodes. These requirements are often outlined in their respective building and electrical codes. It's important to remember that these depths may vary based on specific soil conditions and local amendments to the electrical codes. Consulting with local building and electrical authorities will always give you the most up-to-date requirements. Firstly, in California, the minimum depth requirement is 30 inches, as specified in the California Building Code Section 1802.3. Secondly, Colorado requires a minimum depth of 3 feet, according to the Colorado Electrical Code Section 511.10a. Thirdly, Florida mandates a 24-inch minimum depth, detailed in the Florida Building Code Section R333.46. Fourthly, Illinois requires a minimum depth of 24 inches, as specified in the Illinois Electrical Code Section 350.30. Fifthly, Maryland also has a 24-inch minimum depth requirement, outlined in the Maryland Electrical Code Section 250.52. Sixthly, Michigan requires a minimum depth of 30 inches, according to the Michigan Administrative Code R408.3031. Seventhly, Missouri has a minimum depth requirement of 24 inches, as stated in the Missouri Electrical Code Section 350.30. Eighthly, New Jersey requires a 24-inch minimum depth, detailed in the New Jersey Electrical Code Section 350.30. Ninthly, New York State Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. Tenthly, Ohio requires a minimum depth of 24 inches, as specified in the Ohio Building Code Section 350.15. 11thly, Oregon Administrative Rules Chapter 918.515-100 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. 12thly, Pennsylvania requires a 24-inch minimum depth, as detailed in the Pennsylvania Code Chapter 351, Section 350.30. 13thly, Tennessee Building Code Section 350.30 mandates a minimum depth of 24 inches. 14thly, Texas requires a minimum depth of 24 inches, according to the Texas Electrical Code Section 350.30. 15thly, Utah Electrical Code Section 350.30 has a 24-inch minimum depth requirement. 16thly, Virginia Administrative Code 13 VAC 5-51-250 requires a 24-inch minimum depth. 17thly, Washington requires a minimum depth of 24 inches, as specified in the Washington Administrative Code Chapter 296-46B-100. 18thly, Wisconsin Administrative Code Chapter PSC 110 requires a 24-inch minimum depth. Lastly, the District of Columbia Municipal Regulations Title 11 Section 110.350 mandates a 24-inch minimum depth. These are the jurisdictions we'll cover. However, as previously mentioned, remember to always consult local authorities for the most up-to-date requirements. Concrete encased electrodes, also known as a UFA ground, are a type of grounding electrode used in electrical systems. The National Electrical Code, or NEC, specifies requirements for grounding and bonding to ensure electrical safety. Although the 2002 NEC doesn't specify a particular depth of concrete encased electrodes, various jurisdictions have their own additional stipulations. These can be found in local building codes and electrical codes. In California, the California Building Code Section 1802.3 specifies a minimum depth of 30 inches for out-of-footing concrete encased electrodes. In Colorado, the Colorado Electrical Code Section 511.10 requires a minimum depth of 3 feet. In Florida, the Florida Building Code Section R333.46 mandates a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Illinois, the Illinois Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Maryland, the Maryland Electrical Code Section 250.52 specifies a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Michigan, the Michigan Administrative Code R408.3031 requires a minimum depth of 30 inches. In Missouri, the Missouri Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In New Jersey, the New Jersey Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In New York, the New York State Electrical Code Section 350.30 specifies a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Ohio, the Ohio Building Code Section 350.15 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Oregon Administrative Rules Chapter 918-550-100 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Code Chapter 351 Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Tennessee, the Tennessee Building Code Section 350.30 mandates a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Texas, the Texas Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Utah, the Utah Electrical Code Section 350.30 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Virginia, the Virginia Administrative Code 13 VAC 5-51-250 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Washington, the Washington Administrative Code Chapter 296-46B-100 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Administrative Code Chapter PSC 110 requires a minimum depth of 24 inches. In the District of Columbia, the District of Columbia Municipal Regulations Title 11 Section 110.350 mandates a minimum depth of 24 inches. It is critical to verify these requirements with local authorities because these depths may vary based on specific soil conditions, local amendments to the electrical codes, and specific project requirements. Always consult with local building and electrical authorities for the most up-to-date requirements.